Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation, even if I did not understand. So, I'm very happy to be with you this evening on the invitation of the Lithuanian Free Market Institute, which is doing a great job here. And I will speak about property, law, and economics. I hope you can hear me. I don't need the micro, it's okay? Yes. Okay. So, property, law, and economics. I think it is a very important topic, and it can even be said that most problems, most social problems, are problems of property. And so it is important to make clear what we mean by that and how to define property rights and so on. So I would like first to explain why we have to care about property rights. Then I will discuss the problem of defining property rights. I will give some examples, some implications of the importance of defining property rights correctly. And then I will discuss the relations between law, democracy, and property rights. Finally, I may give some thoughts to a very specific problem, which is both important and interesting, which is the problem of intellectual property, which is not an easy problem, but I think it is, especially in our time, useful to discuss this topic. So, why to discuss about, why to care about property rights? There may be two justifications. One is utilitarian and the other one is moral. Let me just begin with the utilitarian justifications for caring about property rights. We, as human beings, we are living in a world of scarcity. And as resources are scarce, it is necessary to define who has the right to use them. In some sense, property rights can be defined as the right to exclude others from the use of resources. And what is important with property rights is not the relation between an individual and the goods, commodities, but relations between people, between individuals. So, in any society, property rights necessarily exist because scarcity exists. And the main problem, in my opinion, is to know to which extent property rights are clearly defined and to which extent they are legitimate. And speaking of legitimacy, it means that I have to care about the morality of the definition, the legitimacy of property right. But just before, let me stress at the beginning that whenever someone is an owner of something, he is induced to take care of it and to use it in the best way. And this is one utilitarian justification of the definition of property rights. But let me now shift to the moral justification for defining property rights. We may start from the fact that resources do not exist by themselves. Resources become resources whenever the human mind is applied to material goods. Let me just take an example. A diamond, for instance, is a stone like any one. And it is without any value. It cannot be considered as an economic resource as long as someone has not invented a use for this stone, invented a way to cut it, to do it something which is attractive, which gives satisfactions. There is a very interesting book, I recommend it to you, by Julian Simon, which is called the ultimate resource. And he explains, for instance, that raw materials do not exist by themselves, resources do not exist by themselves, resources exist only when they are linked to a human project. And he's explaining in some sense that there is only one resource, which is a human mind. That's it. You know, economists quite often in their models are assuming that there are two factors of production: capital and work and labor. But in fact there is only one, which is the human mind. And the human mind is creating capital, is giving value to things. And things have value only as long as they can be used in a human project. So starting from that, we may analyze human activity. Human beings are creating wealth, and they are doing it by using their mind. Okay. What does it mean to be free? To be free means that you do not belong to someone else, that someone else cannot impose some constraint on you. You are not a slave, in one word. A slave is someone who is obliged to obey to someone else. So, in some sense, being free means that one is the owner of oneself. But what should it mean to be the owner of oneself if you are not the owner of what you are creating by using your mind? And I think that it is important to see that there is a very strong relation between the legitimacy of property rights and creation. It is legitimate to be the owner of what you have created by the use of your mind. And we will see that there are many examples in which there is this link between creation and the definition of a property right. So we see that there are two ways for people to get property rights. One way is to get freely by one's own activity, and the other one, which is not legitimate, is to get it by the use of constraint. And certainly we all prefer to act freely than to act under constraint. It is strange, by the way, that in any textbook about economics, you do not find this basic distinction between what is free and what is constrained. It is not the same to act in one way or the other. And so it is important to make this distinction. It is one of the most important distinctions you can make to understand the working of a society, the behavior of individuals in a society. Speaking about constraint, we are obliged to speak about the state, which is one important example of the use of constraint. And the state can be defined as this organization which has a monopoly of legal constraint. But legal doesn't mean legitimate. We have to make the distinction. So I will not discuss that right now, but later on I will discuss this problem, which is very important because certainly the state using constraint, it is a great problem for us if we consider that legitimate property rights are obtained freely by the free activity of individuals. And for instance, it is quite different that resources be distributed by those who have created them and who are the legitimate owners, or distributed by someone else. We have all heard this sentence, the state is redistributing national income. And even this term, national income, can be criticized. There is no national income, because income is not created by the nation. The resources are always created by individuals who are the legitimate owners. So the national income in some sense doesn't exist. You happen to allocate, to redistribute the national income. You have to be respectful of the property rights of people because it is the only way for people to be free. And we will have only to wonder later on whether in some cases it is legitimate to use constraint in order to allocate some commodities, and to which extent the role of the state is can be justified. So it is a fundamental problem to define and to be respectful, certainly, of property right. And I must add that whenever property rights are defined precisely, you can define to which extent people are responsible. If property rights are rather vague, as it is the case in a collectivist society, in a communist country, where property rights do exist, but they are vague and not legitimate. So one doesn't know exactly to what he is entitled, and so you cannot define responsibility. Being responsible means that you bear yourself the consequences of what you are doing. So when you are a legitimate owner of something, and if you are using this thing in such a way that you are attacking the rights of other people, then it is not legitimate, and you must not do it, and you must give a compensation for that. So all this concept, freedom, property, and responsibility are very closely linked together and cannot be considered separately. Anyhow, we may avoid some ambiguities, and I would like just to give one or two examples, just to show that why it is important to define precisely property rights. For instance, it is quite often claimed that a free society is a society where there is freedom of speech. What does it mean, freedom of speech? It doesn't mean that you have the right to express your ideas anywhere, in any conditions. You can express your ideas only either in your own place, which you own, or in other places if you are entitled to do it by the legitimate owner of this place. You have, no, for instance, no right to express your ideas in any newspaper. The owner of the newspaper is a legitimate owner, and if it can, as a legitimate owner, he can make a contract with you in order for you to write an article. So freedom of speech is not an unlimited freedom. Your freedom is limited by the freedom of others, but the freedom essentially means property. Now, the principle, I think, the principles are rather clear about property rights and the importance of property rights, but the problem now is to define, how to define property right. As I just said, one possibility, or the most legitimate possibility, is to link the definition of property rights to the creation of resources. This is an old liberal tradition. For instance, John Locke said that you cannot just imagine that there is a land which doesn't belong to anyone. It is a free good. And it is not sufficient, said John Locke, just to go to this land and to say, this is mine, I am the owner. It is legitimate to be the owner as soon as one is mixing his own work and his own ideas to the land. If it is growing something, for instance, on this land, it has not been used by any other one before, but as soon as you are using it to create new resources, you can be considered as a legitimate owner of this land. And it is really striking to see that spontaneously, quite often, when they are free to do it at least, individuals rediscovered this idea which has been expressed by philosophers. And I would like to give you some examples. First example, it is the example of the American West after America has been discovered. Some Europeans came and first they settled on the east coast of North America, and little by little they went to the west. And it is quite often said that it was the Wild West, the lawless people went to the west, and it is in fact quite different. At the beginning, there was no scarcity of land, because there were very few people who wanted to settle there. So there was free land, not completely, because in fact there was the Indians, but the rights of the Indians have been quite often forgotten. But let us just assume that the Indians did not exist, and it was a completely free land belonging to no one. So in the beginning, people were not interested in defining property rights on land, because it was not scarce. And they thought it was more important to define property rights on cattle, for instance. They were cattle breeders, and they put a brand, each owner of cattle put a brand with a red iron on the cows in order to know who was the owner of such and such cows. But little by little, the land became less scarce. Some people wanted to become farmers, they wanted to grow vegetables or fruits and so on. And so a conflict began between the cattle breeders who were accustomed to go anywhere and the farmers. And at the same time, there was a technological invention which was barbed wire. So it was less costly to determine property rights on the land, and more useful because people needed to have property rights on the land. And so, little by little, it has been decided by discussion, debate between people, that the one who was growing agricultural commodities was a legitimate owner, and the cattle breeders had no right to come to their property. So spontaneously, these people rediscovered the idea of Locke. The first one who is using an idle resource is the legitimate owner of this thing. There are many possible examples of that. Another example, which also has been the case in America, in the West. For instance, just imagine you have a river, and at one time here the river is going that way, that's upstream and downstream, and here there is, for instance, a fisherman taking fish. And one day, later on, a chemical factory is is built here, and it is polluting the river. It has been recognized that the fisherman has prior rights, because he was the first one to invent a use of the river. He was not the owner of the whole river. He was the owner of some clean water. And this has been decided by judges. It has been the role, quite often in history, it has been the role of judges to decide the rights of people who were debating about that, and it has always been decided by judges in the traditional law that the first one who was was using a resource was the legitimate owner. And once more, the fisherman is not the owner of the whole river, but only of one use of the river. Another example is the one of radio frequencies, radio waves. And in the US, for instance, in the beginning, when the radio has been invented, there has been a first one who decided to broadcast, and he did it with a given frequency he chose and on a given area. Little by little, newcomers arrived, and they wanted also to have a radio broadcasting, but there could be conflicts because people could use the same frequencies, or maybe there was, for instance, one who was broadcasting on this area, another one was coming here, and so there was a conflict here because he was using the same frequency in part of the area. And all these conflicts have been solved quite easily by judges who said the first one to come is the legitimate owner. So once more, it is the recognition of this link between the creation, the invention of a use of a resource. For long, airwaves have not been used, they were not scarce, and little by little they became scarce, and it was necessary to define property rights. And the judges decided that the first one was the legitimate owner. In many countries, it is the case in my country, it has been decided that the state was the owner of the waves. There is no justification for that. There is no justification. And so, there have been several possibilities. In many cases, it has been the case in France, the state decided that as the owner of the airwaves, he was also the monopolist of broadcasting, and there were only, for some time, public broadcasting. Finally, private radio were created very recently, by the way, in France, and it has been decided that a special committee would allocate the frequencies and the areas to the people who were asking for a frequency. And this is completely arbitrary. Completely arbitrary. It depends on the prejudices of the members of the committee. It would be more legitimate and more efficient to recognize that the first who are using the waves are the owners, and they can sell their frequencies to the one. So those who would be the most efficient in using the waves would get the property. And here you see, efficiency is a consequence of legitimacy. And I think that it would be important always to try to be respectful of this link between property rights, or definition of property rights, and creation. One more word about this problem. Defining property rights always implies a cost, but it has some benefits for the reasons I just gave. And I gave you already an example, the example of the fences which have been built in the west, right west of America. Whenever it has been less costly to define property rights on land, it has been done because in cost-benefit analysis made possible to consider that there was a net return by defining property rights. We will later on discuss the problem of what is called public goods. Public goods can be defined as the goods which are not owned, for which there is no definition of property rights. But the problem will be to decide whether there is no definition of property rights, because it would be too costly to define property rights, or because, for instance, the state doesn't want property rights to be defined. So it can be a technical impossibility, or it can be the result of public constraint. I may just take for the moment an example. We consider, for instance, that pavements in a city are public goods. Why we consider that? We could imagine that pavements be privatized, but with present techniques, it may be too costly to measure the number of meters used by everyone on pavements, and it is considered that it is better to decide that it is a public goods, which means that it is a good belonging to everyone, to all those who want to use it. So I will come back to this problem later on. So now I would like to give some implication of the usefulness of defining property rights, and I will begin with the problem of environment and, if you want, ecology. First example I would like to give is an example, one or two examples taken from the specific area of Africa, which is Sahel. As you do know, Sahel is a dry area with a few vegetation. And once there were people in a small plane who were taking photographs in order to design maps of the part of the Sahel, and everything was yellow or brown as it is in Sahel, and they saw a green small area, and so they wondered why there was this green place, and they thought that it was because there was some water in this place. So when they landed, they went to this place to see the explanation, and what did they find? They find fences, just because some people had found that it was possible to grow vegetables, fruits in this place, and in fact it was not a physical problem, but a problem of property rights. I have myself seen exactly the same. Once I was in an African country, in Mali, and someone drove me some kilometers from the capital city, about 10 or 15 kilometers. Everything was dry, without any fields, and somewhere there were fences. And this man told me, I own that, I took that. In principle, there is no private property right, but I decided to to develop, to grow some vegetables and fruits, because there is always water underground, but people quite often don't extract it. And whenever you put a pump, you can have water in the soil. But the problem is to make other people recognize your property rights. And this man told me the problem is that there is no official definition of property rights, which is the case in most of Africa, so that I don't want to have a larger area, because I fear that the state would come and say you must not own that. So you see, there is this conflict between a spontaneous definition of property rights and the role of the state, which considers that it is a legitimate owner of all the land. I must say that one reason why there is underdevelopment in a great part of Africa and other continents also is that it is considered that you cannot privatize land. That land is a public good, which is open to anyone. I also remember having seen in another African country the following situation. It is very important for people to have wood in order to cook what they have to eat. And you can see in this city people, men living the morning with donkeys or camels and going to take wood. But as there is no private property, it is in the interest of people to cut trees but not to grow trees. And so people are obliged to go farther and farther, to do kilometers and kilometers, because all around the city the trees have been destroyed. Which means that quite often we consider that a landscape is depending on the climate, but quite often it is depending on property rights. It is the fact that property rights are not well defined which determines the landscape. I have seen several examples like that in Africa. For instance, also for long, cattle breeders were accustomed to use a limited number of cows, because they did know that if ever there were too many, there would be less water available for the cattle and so on. And so there was recognition of the rights of each family to use, for instance, a pond of water for their animals. And when there was colonization by the French administration, they decided that it was not allowed to define private property rights, and the consequence was that there were an increase in the number of cows and sheep and so on, so that water disappeared in many places, the grass disappeared and so on, and there has been a problem which quite often has been attributed to climatic conditions, but quite often the desert is a consequence of a bad definition of property right. So that's the first example about the importance of property right. The second one I would like to give is the example of Amazon, because quite often you hear people discussing about the Amazon and claiming that capitalist firms are cutting trees, and the Amazon is the lung of humanity, and it is a collective wealth, and it is because there are greedy capitalists that the forest is destroyed. But they just forget that the forest belongs to the state, also to the Brazilian state, and only the Brazilian state gives concessions. He gives the authorization to some firms to cut the trees, But when you have a concession, you are interested in cutting trees, but not in growing trees. If you are a capitalist owner of a forest, you know that your interest, if you cut a tree, is to grow another tree. And it is quite characteristic when you see a map of forest in the world. You see that forests are decreasing wherever they are public. And they are increasing even in countries where there is a lot of population. They are increasing whenever they are private, because there is a return on the forest, and there is an incentive to grow tree. Another example I wanted to give you is the one of elephants. I think that all of us, we do like elephants. They are very nice animals. And quite often we hear about the fact that there are disappearing of elephants and they have to be protected. So there is an international convention about ivory to forbid the trade in ivory, which has perverse effect, because whenever it is forbidden to trade ivory, there is a black market, and the price of ivory is increasing because there is a risk in trading ivory. So people go on killing elephants. It is illegal, but they do it because they can get a profit. The solution has been found in some countries. For instance, in Zimbabwe, partly in South Africa, just to privatize elephants. In Zimbabwe, for instance, it has been decided that the inhabitants of villages were the owners, the legitimate owners of the elephants in the area where they are. And within a few years, the number of elephants increased terribly, because people found profitable to grow elephants, to sell the meat, the ivory, and so on. So the best way in order to protect an species is to privatize them. If ever it had been decided, for instance, that cows were a public good, that everyone could kill a cow and eat it, there would be no more cows, there would be no more meat. And this sort of story we find quite often. It is the case with tortoises. It has been decided that it was illegal to trade tortoise shell, but the consequence is the same as for elephants. And there had been some tortoise farms at the time, and they were protecting the tortoises. And when the ecologists were successful in forbidding the trade on tortoise shell, then the farms had to disappear, and there is no more anyone to protect the tortoise. So we have always the same story. It is very important to define private property rights. To take two very different examples. One example is the example of immigration. I already mentioned the principle of the freedom of speech, and I could mention now the principle of the freedom of circulation. As a liberal, I'm in favor of the freedom of circulation. I'm in favor of immigration and immigration. But what does it mean exactly? Saying that you are free to move doesn't mean that you are free to go anywhere. For instance, if you are the owner of a house, you are free to exclude whoever you want from entering into your house, because you are the legitimate owner. So, saying that there is freedom of immigration doesn't mean that anyone can come and enter the house, take the jobs of people, and so on. But it is quite legitimate that we allow people to contract. If I I'm the owner of a house and I agree to rent it to someone coming from another country, that's my decision, his decision, and it is perfectly legitimate. If the same for a job contract and so on. And the problem we have right now in many countries, maybe in all countries, is that the state has nationalized the right to exclude. It is a state which decides that such and such people are authorized to come, to migrate, and that other people are not authorized. And so it creates conflicts because there are disagreements about that. There are some people who want more immigration, some who want less immigration, and it is impossible to find an agreement between all people. And that's the reason why it is a very important subject of debate in many of our countries, because instead of recognizing the right of people to use what they own as they want, and the freedom to move of people, the state decided that it was in some sense the owner of the country, and it can decide who is allowed to come to the country or not. Another topic I would like to give is about economic policy, and more precisely what is sometimes called stabilization policy. I would like to take two examples about that. In our time, we are used to the idea that it is the responsibility of the state to be the producer of money. So there is no private production of money, in spite of the fact it has been the case for the most great part of the history of mankind. And I would like just to compare these two periods. In the past, there were, for instance, banks issuing paper money, issuing notes. And what did they do? A banker decided to create a currency, and the note was a claim, for instance, on a given quantity of gold. The banker was promising to exchange the note against a given quantity of gold or silver or whatever you want, whenever the holder of the note wanted to exchange it. So there was a contract between legitimate owners with precise property rights. The banker was the owner of the gold deposited in the bank, and the money holder was the owner of the note, and there was a contract, legitimate contract between them. Just imagine that the banker had promised to exchange, let me say, 1 litas against 1 gram of gold, and when the one who has a note of 1 litas comes back to the bank to exchange it, the banker says, "Oh, I'll give you only half a gram of gold." What is it that? It is a breach of contract. It means that you are stealing people. You are not honoring your promise. And in a civilized society, it's not possible. The banker who would do that, maybe would go to jail, or at least he would lose all his clients. What happens right now? Little by little, public monetary authorities took the monopoly in exchanging notes against gold. What we quite often call the gold standard is a system in which the central bank is promising to exchange the national currency it is issuing against gold. But we have seen from history that quite often the central bank doesn't honor its promise, it is devaluing. And it is strange that in our time people consider that devaluation is a legitimate instrument of economic policy. But it ought to be considered for what it is. It is a robbery. You rob someone of his property, you have promised to give 1 gram of gold and you give only half a gram of gold, it is a robbery, nothing else than that. And so you see the difference which exists between both systems. And what is the consequence? The consequence is that as long as the convertibility guarantee has been given by capitalists, it has been honored. And there was no excess creation of money, no inflation. If you look at the long run for 20th century or so, you have about stable prices, and then in the 20th century you have a terrific increase in prices. And increase in prices, it means a deterioration of the quality of money, because it means that money is useful as far as it is a purchasing power. You can exchange against commodities, and if there is inflation, it means that you have less and less purchasing power. And if you have a devaluation, it's exactly the same. So never in history has money been so bad as in the 20th and 21st century, because there was a public ownership of money creation. And there is another aspect of this problem which is also important. All of us, certainly, all of you certainly know about the recent economic crisis. In my opinion, it has been created precisely by an excess creation of money. But there is another aspect of it which is also important, and which is the following. Quite often people say that the crisis has been caused by the fact that there are greedy capitalists, greedy bankers who take too many risks in order to get a profit. And they say that it is immoral, that capitalism is immoral, and so on. In my opinion, the crisis has been caused by the fact that there has been too much money created by central banks, but I don't want to develop that. What I want to stress is the following. Once more, I think it is interesting to compare two systems. The system of the past and the system we have now. In the past, we had a great number of small or medium-sized banks which were owned by capitalists. A small bank belonged to one capitalist or maybe a small group of capitalists. And it is quite characteristic that at that time, in the balance sheet of banks, we had 50 to even 80% of the balance sheet composed of equity capital, which means a capital belonging to the owner of the bank. And so the banker was lending his own money. And as he was lending his own money, he did not want to take too many risks because he did not want to go bankrupt. So there was this adjustment process because there were very clear property rights by people who could decide because they were legitimate owners of the bank. What we have now, we have a very big banks, and one reason for that is that is interventionism also, because as you know, there is this idea too big to fail is if a bank is very big. Monetary authorities, public authorities will prevent it from going bankrupt and will save it. So there is a tendency to be very big. And so there are very large banks with a great number of shareholders who are the owners of the bank as shareholders. But each of them is too small to have any influence on decisions. And decisions are taken by, in fact, managers who are not capitalists but who are wage earners. So their interest is to get a great profit in the short run, and they may take too much risk in order to, for instance, to have a great bonus. And so when people say that bankers are taking too many risks because they want to get return, and they say that it means that capitalism is an unstable system, they are completely wrong. In a real capitalist system, people are induced not to take too many risks because they are responsible. As once more, property rights are the foundation of responsibility, and this is the reason why it is always important to try to have a legitimate and precise definition of property rights. Now, I would like to give some attention to the problem of property rights, the law, and democracy. Speaking about the state, we have to consider two different problems. One problem is the limit between the state and the civil society and private activities. And the distinction we can make from this point of view is between totalitarian regime, where the state is in charge of nearly everything, and liberal regime, where people have freedom to act. Now, whenever a state exists, it can be democratic or no. But it is a principle of organization. I stress that because in our time, it is quite often considered that what is important is democracy. I was struck by the fact that after the collapse of the communist regime in many countries of Europe, many people, for instance in my country, insisted on the fact that it was a return to democracy. To me, what was important was the return to free decisions of people, to freedom, to individual freedom. So that's quite often a confusion which is made between both, and it is not at all the same. Democracy can be tyrannical. It can be tyrannical because democracy relies only on one rule, which is the law of majority. But it is not because a majority is deciding something that it is fair and efficient. If you have, for instance, in a village, 51% of people deciding to plunder the other ones, it is not legitimate, certainly. And this is the problem we face, that democracy, or certainly also all tyrannical regime, can get hold of the property of people under the pretext that it is the law of majority. But once more, majority doesn't mean that it is fair. And that's the reason why we have to distinguish very precisely the problem of democracy and the problem of property rights. We have to defend individual property rights more than democracy. Certainly, I prefer democracy to absolutism, but anyhow, democracy, as I said, can be tyrannical. In some cases, democracy is used, but it is not contradictory with property right. Let me take one or two examples. For instance, let us consider what happens in a firm. In a firm, you have private owners, who are the shareholders, and they know that they have to take collective decisions. And they decide, just for efficiency reasons, they decide that decision will be taken with majority, or maybe a majority of 2/3 of the votes, because they know that it is quite impossible to have unanimity, and so empirically it's better to decide that. But the one who buys a share and enters into this system knows that it is possible that a decision will be taken with which he doesn't agree, and in some sense it can be considered that it is an attack on his property rights, but he has accepted that. So if ever you use the law of majority in that case, there is no conflict between the law of majority and property rights. You are respectful of property rights. It is the same in the condominium, for instance. In a condominium, people quite often consider that collective decisions have to be taken, and decide that the law of majority is the easiest way for that. But once more, there is no conflict between property rights and the law of majority. First, because the voting rights are proportional to the property rights, and second, because you can freely enter and go out of the condominium. It is the same with association and so on. But whenever you have legal constraint, it is completely different. That's the case of the state. The problem is the use of constraint against the will of people. So I intended to speak about two more things about the state. I will go very fast because I see that the time is going out. I just want first to say some words about taxation, and then about public goods. Taxation is the use of constraint, and taxation is an attack on property. The state takes something which belongs to people, and the justification which is given to that certainly is public goods. I will come back to that quite soon. But I would just like to give one example, which is the case of the progressive income tax. I know that in Lithuania, happily, you have no progressive income tax, even if there is a debate about that. You have a flat tax, and as it is the case in some countries which have been under a communist regime, and these countries are giving a good example to a country like mine. We have not yet, and happily, taken the example, implemented this example. Anyhow, one may ask why there is progressive income tax quite in many countries. Many people say that it is fair. I don't think it is, because I cannot consider that a very strong attack on property is fair. There are people in France, who are obliged to pay as taxes more than their income. So it is a complete spoliation. It is complete plundering of people. Why does it exist? It just exists because of the law of majority. It is always possible to find a majority of people to take the property of other people. And as wealthy people are in minority, so progressive income tax exists, or wealth tax also. But once more, it is not because it is legal that it is legitimate. And we must always stress the problem of legitimacy. One word about public goods. Economists have defined a very sophisticated theory of public goods. It is said that whenever there is no real scarcity, because a good is so abundant that all people can use it, and that when someone doesn't diminish what is available for other people, it is a public good, and the public good ought to be produced by the state, which would be justification for taxation. So implicitly it is said that whenever there are public goods, all people agree on the fact that they are constrained to pay the tax, because other ones are also constrained. If the payment was voluntary, there would be the risk that the good would not be produced, because each individual would consider that if ever he doesn't pay, the other ones will pay, and he will benefit from the good. An example which is quite often taken is the one of national defense. If I don't want to pay freely for national defense, and if some people pay for it, anyhow, I benefit from it. And so it is said, if everyone is deciding in the same way, a good which could be desired by the whole population will not be produced if the financing is voluntary. So we have to constrain people to pay. This would be acceptable if there was unanimity, but unanimity never exists. Just take the example of national defense, I just quoted, because some people may be against the existence of an army. Some people would like to have an atomic bomb, the other ones are against atomic bomb, and so on. There is no agreement. And we see that quite often what is called public good is in fact a good which is desired by either the majority or even a minority of people who have the power to decide and to constrain the other. And they call that public good because they want it to be produced by the state. And the state quite often, maybe always, not only decides to produce the good or service, but decide to take the monopoly, which is even more. And whenever you have a monopoly, it means that no one can supply a better service or a better good. You make impossible any innovation whenever you have a state monopoly. So quite often the idea that there are public goods is a way for the state to have a monopoly and for instance to give some privilege to a given category of voters. Now finally I would like to just give some attention to the problem of intellectual property. It is a very interesting problem. I must say that it is maybe a field where I have not always thought exactly in the same way. Some years ago I was convinced that, for instance, patents were important because whenever you have a patent you have an incentive to innovate, to invent new techniques and so on, because you know that you can get the return on what you have invented. And it may be true that the fact that patents existed has played a positive role in the taking off of many countries in the 18th or 19th century. In some sense, it is an application of what I said previously. if you are creating a new idea, you are the legitimate owner of it. So there is some coherence in saying that patents, copyright, and so on have to exist. The problem is that it has been that the state is giving a monopoly to someone. As far as someone gets a patent, it is impossible for other people to do the same invention or to improve the invention which has been done. And some libertarians object to intellectual property rights because they say whenever there is a state protection of intellectual property rights, it means that it forbids other people to think the same way. For liberal, it is a problem because you have no rights on other people. You have no rights on the minds of other people. One aspect of the problem, and this is the reason why it is difficult to solve this problem of intellectual property rights, is the following. Whenever you have a new idea, when it is in your mind, you are the owner of this idea. It is yours. But whenever you express it, it can be spread all over the world at no cost, about no cost. There is no cost to produce and to spread an idea. And because there is no scarcity, you may be tempted to say property rights are useful as far as there is a problem of scarcity. But there is no scarcity with ideas. Now, when I began, I told you there are two justifications of property rights. One is utilitarian. Because there is scarcity, it is necessary to define property rights. If there is no scarcity, it is not necessary. But saying that it is not necessary doesn't mean that you must not define property rights. But the second justification for property rights is the moral one. And here there is a difficulty. If I say, for instance, the sky is blue, and one of you 10 minutes later say the sky is blue, and I say, oh, you are not allowed to say that, I am the owner of this idea. You will say, no, it is impossible that you are the owner of this idea, and maybe we can prove that someone before me said exactly the same, so you are not the first one to say that. It seems quite obvious that you can demonstrate that I am not the owner of this sentence. But let me say that I write a book. I consider that I am the owner of the ideas expressed in the book. If there is no intellectual property right, someone comes, take the book and publish it with his name. We consider that it is a robbery because he took the ideas of someone else. So between both these extremes, where is the limit? It's not that easy, you know. And in fact, the difficulty is not a problem of principle, but a problem, a practical problem. So I am tempted to say that it is justified to define intellectual property rights. The problem is to define them. And I think that the real difficulty comes from the fact that in our world, intellectual property rights are defined by the state, and the state decides arbitrarily that, for instance, a patent or a copyright will last for 10, 20 or 30 years, and after that it will be a collective good, a public good, which can be obtained by anyone. But why should we not come back to what I described, the decision by a judge? I write a book, someone publishes the same book with his name. I go to the judge and say, you see, I have published that before this man. Maybe he has invented by himself, but anyhow, I was the first use of this, of all these chapters. And so the judge would say, yeah, he has a right, and you are the legitimate owner of these ideas. So I think that there cannot be perfection in such a field. But I think that if ever we were to recognize that intellectual property rights are legitimate, but that the state ought not to intervene in defining them, but that the judge is legitimate, that I think would be some improvement. And this brings me to stress that what is important in a society is not to have a state which is deciding legislation, which is creating laws. What is important is to have principles, and among principles, property rights are really what is the most important, and to have people as arbitrators who have judges. The judge is more important than the parliament, if he is well educated. I know that in our time, and happily, judges do not know the good principles about property rights and so on. But it is more important to have a good judge than to have a parliament. And this is one reason why even if we have democracy, we cannot protect property rights in the best way. You know that Friedrich Hayek, for instance, wrote a book which is called Law, Legislation and Liberty. And he makes a very strong opposition, rightly, between law and legislation. Law is what is spontaneously discovered by people. And in the case where there is a private definition of property rights and where the judge is there, the judge is not creating property rights. He is recognizing them, which is not the same. In a system of legislation, there is a set of individuals, the members of the government, of the parliament, who decide arbitrarily the rights of other people. They create from nothing property rights. And this, in my opinion, is not legitimate. So I think it is exactly the problem we have with intellectual property right. The problem is not, in my opinion, that there is something different between, for instance, on the one hand, intellectual property right, and on the other hand, land, property on land or other goods. The main problem is this one. Should we wait for a definition of property rights by the state, that is legislation, or should we rather desire a spontaneous definition and what we can call really the law, which is relying on principles. As you may know, in Europe there are two traditions. The British tradition is closer to the spontaneous process of law, and little by little property rights are discovered by a process of going to the courts, and the continental tradition is more a legalist tradition, and certainly I consider that the British tradition is closer to what we ought to defend. So I will stop here, and if ever you have some questions, please let me know.